Hi, so we're going to be looking at the preservation and conservation treatments of 18th century parchment with iron gall ink. For my research, I used the Charters of Freedom, which is the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and Delaware's copy of the U.S. Bill of Rights, held at the National Archive, and how their preservation and conservation techniques either trickle down or don't trickle down into smaller repositories. I used two other parchment documents from the 18th century written on with iron gall ink within the United States as my control. Okay, so a little bit about the characteristics of parchment. Parchment is a sheepskin. The quality of parchment depends on the animal and its lifestyle, as well as the manufacturer of the parchment. Parchment is created as the animal skin is soaked in a lime solution, cleaned, and then placed on a high-tension rack to dry. After it's dried, a shaving knife or pumice stone is used to remove the excess hair and smooth out the surface. A unique part of parchment is that it is collagen-based, and this feature allows that when the water is removed between the fibers during drying, a space is left between the fibers, allowing the material to expand and contract with reintroduction of moisture, such as humidity. Parchment is translucent in appearance, but the material is actually very strong and long-lasting. It's traditionally used for book materials, official and private records, fine art, and ritual or sacred objects. Now a little bit about iron gall ink. The four main ingredients are tannin, vitriol, gum arabic, and water. The recipes vary from batch to batch depending on the materials available as well as the creator. Iron gall ink is permanent, as once it oxidizes with the atmosphere, it causes a chemical reaction to literally burn into the parchment or paper. It is highly acidic in nature, which can cause problems with conservation and preservation later on. The combination of parchment and iron gall ink was to ensure a permanent documentation of information, but there are some problems that occur the longer the document is around and mishandled. For instance, if parchment is exposed to too much moisture, it can create cockling, which actually permanently changes the document as it will forever have creases. Another problem is that light and air exposure can cause the iron gall ink to fade or burn completely through the parchment. There's other problems such as tearing and pieces flaking off on parchment if it is improperly stored. So here's some of the basic conservation treatments and preservation practices that are done for parchment with iron gall ink. The two main ones that I looked at in my paper were the humidification and flattening of parchment. Humidification can be done in one of two ways. The first way is to do the entire document in a humidity chamber, and the other way is to apply humidity to certain sections of the parchment. And the second way is usually applied with Gore-Tex, which is a fiber that acts as a barrier and filter between the application of the moisture and the actual parchment itself. The second practice of flattening has two different schools of thought. Flattening, in some people's eyes, is the only way that other conservation and preservation tactics can be done, because you can't clean it if it's rolled up, and you can't store it if it's rolled up, because it will then get stuck that way. Well, the other side of the argument is that parchment is not meant to lay flat, so adding humidity to it in order to make it flat and then store it that way will actually cause more damage in the long run. We will look at more of the encasement and the monitoring and preservation tactics in the next few slides. So the three parchment manuscripts I used with iron gall ink were the Charters of Freedom, which includes the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and Delaware's copy of the U.S. Bill of Rights. To give you some clarification, the Bill of Rights, 14 copies were made after it was ratified in Congress for the states to individually ratify. And so there used to be 14 copies. The two that I used were the Delaware, which is a part of the display in the National Archives, and then the other copy is Virginia's copy, which is held at the Library of Virginia. The last manuscript that I used was an example of land deeds that in colonial times that is held by the New York Historical Society. So here's a comparison of the conservation and preservation practices that were done in the manuscripts I studied. I would like to note that the Charters of Freedom have actually undergone two encasements. The first one in 1950, which used helium gas, and they had to remove it because the glass started touching the parchment and causing a reaction. So the new one was finished in 2003 as a titanium frame, and they replaced the gas from helium to argon. All three of these systems, their encasements have a monitoring system to ensure that there is no leakage of the gas, as well as no oxygen is allowed to get in within the encasement. The land deeds, there wasn't any information pertaining to the housing, but it was placed in a custom box after the conservation treatment of flattening and cleaning. But it all supports my final conclusion. Parchment with iron gall ink is a unique archival material that must have preservation and conservation practices analyzed on a case-by-case basis. As seen in the table, each manuscript requires its own conditions, and while similar in nature, the same methods cannot be applied across the board. Conservation practices change with new discoveries. Therefore, manuscripts should have the availability for new practices to be applied, but it must be carefully considered by the archivist and conservationist doing the actual treatment. As Wood states, the key to conservation is to ensure reversibility. So if a new treatment better suits the material, other treatments can be removed. He used a medical analogy at the end of his paper, saying we should not let disease dictate our actions, but instead tailor our treatment to the needs of the patient. Essentially, manuscripts of parchment with iron gall ink are the same. We can apply broad practices, but in the end, it's going to come down to what the individual parchment needs and how it can be properly preserved for a long and healthy life.